Yes, so indeed, good introduction. There is difficult to see. I'm going to talk about chronism in Egypt, and in particular through the angle of the financial sector. So perhaps a quick history of the private sector in Egypt. We already had a bit of a presentation by the journalist from Akhbar al-Yom. The characteristics of the private sector in Egypt is indeed that it was nationalized by Nasser first, and so it got a late second start with Sadat's infitah. And basically under Sadat, the private sector was small and dominated by a marriage of old money that predated the first period of capitalism in Egypt with the state bourgeoisie. And this has been well described in the literature. The second kind of big growth of the private sector took place in the 1990s with the structural adjustment that was undertaken in that period. And then there was a second boom with the 2004 push under Gamal Mubarak and the cabinet of business people that we talked about in an earlier session. Now, the question that really confronts us is whether that period of close association between the public sector and the state and businesses was actually favorable to growth or unfavorable. And it's theoretically or around the world, we've seen both cases. I mean, we've talked already about the Asian case where close relationship were useful. This relationship was managed for performance, if you like. But it could also be the case that you have a relationship that is not good for growth. And so we need to be careful on the empirics to try to understand what happens and then to be able to explain why different political regime may give rise to different kind of state-business relation. And the case of Egypt is very interesting, and so it's a bit of a laboratory for many of us to try to understand the impact of state-business relations. Now, in this particular paper, we focus with Mark on the financial sector, the role that it plays, and we ask, did connected firm get a very large share, an inordinate share of credit, and if so, by which mechanisms? And if it did, was this larger amount of credit compensate a larger extent of performance? Were these firms more profitable to attract more funds? So were, if you like, private saving placed in the most efficient part of the economy, or was capital misallocated? And so the puzzle is really mostly related to the fact that banking in Egypt in the 2000s was private, and private banks operate on the basis of profitability. And indeed, it's a puzzle around the world where, very often connected interest get a large share of loans, and yet the banks that are lending them the money are not part of the state apparatus, and so a priori not subject to pressure by political powers. And so one may ask by what mechanism this happens. So the questions that we need to address are, was the banking system in Egypt truly liberalized by the 2000s? I mean, is the banking sector really operating on profitability basis? The answer is going to be most likely yes. Did the politically connected firms get a lion's share of the loans? And the answer is going to be a resounding yes, very large share. And then, so the question is to explore by what mechanism were they able to do that? And there are two possibilities. They could have been very profitable, and so it's normal for banks to lend to them. And you'll see we're going to find that this is not the case. And it could be that they were perceived to be less risky, not necessarily more profitable, but less risky. And then we can ask what does that mean, and in what ways are they more or less risky. So this is the plan, basically, of the presentation. In terms of the financial system development, a quick history, again, Nasser's privatized or nationalized rather the banks as well as industry, and reorganized them in 4 large sector-based banks. These are still the base of the public sector banks that exist today, plus some regional banks. Under Sadat's Infitah, we had several new banks called new joint venture banks, which were combinations or alliances between public banks and foreign interests. And we had to wait for the structural adjustment period for the banking sector to start operating truly as a banking sector with liberalized interest rates, and the beginning of a regulatory framework that imposed capital requirements, capital adequacy, the beginning of modern banking. But still in the early 2000s, the banking sector, which had grown to kind of a normal size by middle income standards, was mostly still dominated by the public sector. And public banks were still dominant, but already about half of credit went to the private sector. There was a very high share of NPLs, of non-performing loan. Again, we talked about it a bit this morning, because lots of loans were pushed to public enterprises that were losing, and to some extent to some of the Sadat cronies. There were deeper reforms in 2003, 2004 with a new banking law, and a lot of reforms. The privatization of an important state bank. State banks owned shares in all the small joint venture banks. Those were sold and became truly private. About 15 foreign banks came in ownership with some of these smaller private banks, and turned them into important, large, competitive private banks. And so the banking sector became much more dynamic and better controlled, really. I should say that part of what happened then also is a resolution of many of the NPLs. There were bailouts and recapitalizations in the form of transformations of loans into assets. But it's important because these bailouts, if you like, created moral hazard for the future, as we would see. The idea that large interests that had lost funds had to be saved in order to save the banks arose out of the reforms of the 2003. By 2008, private banks controlled nearly 50% of deposits and 65% of lending. So the sector became, some, I wouldn't say dominated, but preponderantly private-driven, and NPLs had fallen, as I said. But nevertheless, what is interesting to realize, say, by 2010, which is quite late, just before the Arab Spring, is that that largely private sector banking was extremely concentrated. From the little we know, lending to the private sector was about 30% of GDP, about 50% of total credit. Yet, when we look at surveys of firms, we see that a very small share of firms had access to credit, suggesting that it was just a few large firms that have access to large credit, only 5% of firms, while in other comparable surveys, you find 4 or 5 times more access in other countries. And we also have indications that the top 20 firms have something like 50% of the bank's portfolios, which is a very large level of concentration. So we want to do more careful work here using the Orbis database to identify. The Orbis database is a corporate database that identifies firms. It has about 20,000 firms for Egypt. You can know which firms is which, who controls it, the boards, and you also have the balance sheet of the firm. So we know also how much each firm borrows and who controls it. The first step is to identify the connected businessman. I won't say much about this. Maybe Mark would say a bit more. It's another paper on the impact of cronyism on growth that uses the same techniques. But broadly speaking, we identified 32 families and individuals, which every Egyptian taxi knows about, but we talked with financial institutions, and then we tracked their ownership, and we found 469 firms that they had a large interest in or controlled through board or direct ownership or management. And so we know these firms. 22 of them are traded on the stock market. And so I will use the large database and the subgroup. We know much more, of course, about those that are traded on the stock exchange. In terms of information, they release more information. So the connected firms are present in about half the sector. They are larger, more capital intensive, especially in 2010. They are firms that grow very fast between 2003 and 2010. Concentrated in some sectors, broadly sectors that grew a lot during that period. And many of them are organized in kind of pyramidal fashions where companies own companies that own companies. So it maximizes, if you like, the comparative advantage of ownership. You know, in these pyramids, you can own companies at the third level with only 25% of the shares. So the first question is, do they borrow a lot? Now, in the Orbis database, if I look at all the borrowing by all the firms in 2010 in the database, these 400 and whatever firms have 82% of the total outstanding loans, which is a very, very large number. And if we look across, so run regressions to capture averages, in the full data set, their debt-to-equity ratio is 0.4 larger than the rest of the companies. And in the 22 traded companies, the largest of the controlled companies, their debt-equity is 100% larger. So if the average, I think the average is something like 70%, and they are at 170% debt-to-equity ratio. So there are firms that are very leveraged. A lot of their value is due to debt, and so they were able to grow very fast by borrowing a lot, investing and growing, and earning market shares. Now, were they more profitable? Question number one. By what mechanism did they get so much of the lending? We have in these databases some information on profitability, in particular returns on assets and returns on equity. Again, these are averages in the form of regressions to see what is significant in statistical terms. And if you focus on returns on assets, in one case we find in the full set no advantage. And in the limited set, for the largest company, actually, they make less profits than the rest of the companies traded on the stock exchange. So in terms of the return on their total assets, they are not more profitable than the other firms that get less access to credit. In parentheses, the return on equity is larger. The return on equity is the return on assets plus what you make out of the loans. So that indicates that basically they're borrowing cheap, actually. So they're actually making money on their borrowing, and that compensates for low returns on assets. So actually, their equity holders, their shareholders, made money. They didn't lose. If anybody lost, it must have been the banks or the state, if the state was supporting the banks. So the return on assets were actually larger. But of course, what matters for a bank is not the return on equity, but the return on assets. Actually, it's the banks that are losing in this deal. If we check directly, because we have the information, whether long-term debt to revenues, leverage, is related to profitability, we find that no. A big determinant, if you look at the whole data set, of whether a firm has debt or not, is whether it's connected or not. Actually, we find here that the least profitable a firm is, the more it has borrowed in Egypt over that period where we have the data for. This is very strange because typically bankers are looking for profitability, and private bankers in particular. State banks may be driven by political or strategic motives, but private banks should be driven by profitability considerations. So the question arises as to why are they lending more to firms that have less profits. I want to do a small parenthesis. I mean, how come, one could ask, how come connected firms have less profits than non-connected firms, right? I mean, after all, they have lots of privileges, and you would see in the other paper, we actually look at particular privileges. They are treated better by regulators, they receive energy subsidies, land, they influence policy, they could be bailed out if they fail. How could they possibly have less profits? And I think we have to really think of the relationship between the privileged firms, the clients, and their patrons as one of a gift exchange or a bargaining game. I mean, they're receiving something, but they're giving something out in return as well. You know, they're giving, Ahmed Aiz managed the campaign for parliament and was supposed to manage the presidential campaign. This cost money. Favored firms have to support NGOs that are supportive of the regime. They may have to hire people. They may have to entertain clientelistic relations that are important to power. So it's costly. So on net,
5 minutes.
Yeah, they don't necessarily come out on top, and that may explain the fact that they have less profits. It could also be that their heads are selected because they're loyal and not necessarily good managers. And it's also probably the case that we don't see all their profits. Some are channeled abroad to kind of diversify and strengthen their position and be able to bargain better with their patrons. Now, we argue in the paper that they are, however, less risky, and the main way we see that is by looking at their price-earning ratios for the firms that are traded in the stock market. And as this regression shows, they have 7 points higher price-earning ratios. The price-earning ratios is how the market values earnings. It's 10 times, is the price of a stock 10 times earnings or 20 times earnings? And in the case of these firms, it's on the high side. It's 7 points more than other firms. And that reflects the fact that markets perceive them to be less risky. And so they're willing to pay more money for a particular level of earning. And that suggests that these firms are less risky because they're expected to be bailed out in case they fail, as happened in the bank recapitalization of 2003. And so this, in effect, solves the puzzle. They are better customers, even though they don't have more profitability, because they are perceived to be, at the end of the day, protected by the regimes. They would, one way or another, their debts would be paid. I haven't covered the fact that they own more lands, and so they had more collateral, we find in the paper, and that also could explain more access. I don't have time for this. Maybe in the Q&A, I will show you how their PERs collapsed after the revolution. And so the market shows them, discovers that instead of them being less risky, they become more risky. And so they get priced very unfavorably, actually, relative to the other stocks after the revolution. In conclusion, it is interesting that perhaps in the first phase, connected firms were directly supported by state-owned banks to become dominant. But by the time the banking sector is liberalized, they are already dominant, and as a result, they manage, actually, given their connections, to benefit most from the liberalization of the banking industry. One important implication of this is that credit is misallocated. So if we are to think of macro costs, here we can calculate the macro cost. If this credit was allocated to firms that were more profitable, that were making more profit, the economy, one could ideally compute how many more jobs, for example, the economy could have created. One question for the future is what happens to the loans now. I mean, the banking sector is heavily loaned to firms that are not favored anymore. If they do badly or if they go bankrupt, they may not a priori be bailed out as expected initially and become a big problem for banks and for the countries. So are they too large to fail at this stage? And maybe that explains the fact that the relationship is being reestablished as we go over time if they are perceived to be too large to fail. Thank you.